My name is Joelle, senior writer and family nurse practitioner with Nursejournal.org. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing nurse Keith Carlson with 10 questions with NP Joelle. So thank you so much for taking the opportunity to do this with me today.
Thanks for having me, Joelle. It's really an honor and privilege.
Yes. So the first question is, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got into nursing.
Oh my gosh. Well, I've been a nurse since 1996, got my associates, and then went back and got my bachelor's fairly quickly after that. I've spent literally quarter century not working in acute care. There will be gasps of incredulousness in the audience. I really chose to go the ambulatory care route. And even though I was told it was professional suicide, I never looked back. I said, just watch me. And I've had a really good career. So I focused on intensive outpatient case management, HIV work, home health, hospice, public health, stuff like that, community health centers. And along the way, in the early 2000s, I launched one of the first nursing blogs on the internet called Digital Doorway. That's still going. It's been, 17 years now. And then around 2012, with some partners, launched one of the very first nursing podcasts on the internet, which was RN FM radio. And now I have my own show, The Nurse Keith Show, which has been going quite some time, over 400 episodes. Okay. And I'm a freelance writer. I do keynotes at nursing conferences and a little consulting here and there. And I'm a career coach for nurses. So those are all the different things that I do. And whereas those self-employed sort of things were my side hustle for a while, now actually doing clinical nursing is my side hustle. And my main thing is all of these entrepreneurial ventures.
Great. We're going to talk a little bit about the nurse coaching because that's super interesting. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about your podcast. Like, what made you start a podcast for nurses?
Well, in late 2011, in the depths of winter, I was chatting with lots of different nurses on Twitter. And Twitter was super active with nursing even back then. And I met a couple really cool people, and we all just sort of started talking about podcasts all of a sudden at the same time. And there was only, I believe, one other nursing podcast at the time. And we hopped on Skype, and then we decided, oh, let's just launch one of these things. So we launched RNFM Radio in early 2012 in January, and just learned by the skin of our teeth because nobody knew what they were doing. It was the Wild West. Mm-hmm. And my show spun off that show a few years later. And we just felt like that with this, we saw that this growing audio universe was going to explode. It hadn't quite exploded yet, especially in healthcare, but we could see it was coming. And we thought, why don't we do it? Why don't we kind of hop on it and just kind of test it out? So we felt like we were taking podcasting for a test drive on behalf of the profession, and it worked. So now there's, I don't know how many nursing podcasts there are now. There's well over 150 or maybe 200 now. So it's a real thing now. But 10 years ago, it was pretty new. And we just felt like it was kind of cool. And we did it basically, when we started, it was just for fun, really. And then we realized that people were really interested. So it became more than fun. It became like a mission.
How did you come up with some of your topics?
We started out, there were three of us. And so we had three co-hosts. So there was plenty to talk about between the three of us. We all had different backgrounds. It was Anna Morrison, Kevin Ross, and myself. And then we started having guests pretty quickly on. And when we first launched, it was Blog Talk Radio, which is one of those old school podcasting platforms. And it was actually a call-in show. So from the very first show, we had the opportunity for guests to actually call in, which was kind of cool. So we got to have these really interesting conversations with people, plus a chat room. And podcasting has changed over the years. It's not quite like that anymore, though there might be a few shows out there. So we just basically listened to the marketplace, if you will, and what people were interested in, what the hot topics were, what were the things that seemed to be lighting up social media at the time. And that's basically how I still find my topics, though now people reach out to me all the time. So I have all sorts of cool people on my show. And what I like to do, even though it's a career podcast per se, there's only so much you can say about resumes and cover letters and things. So to a large extent, my show now is really interesting people, mostly nurses, doing really interesting things, which I think, to me, demonstrates to other nurses the breadth and depth of what they're capable of.
Yes. Yes. What steps did you take to become a board certified nurse coach?
Well, it's interesting because, I mentioned I started one of the first nursing blogs, one of the first nursing podcasts, and I was one of the first nurse coaches out there. And it's not because I'm super smart or prescient. I just happened to have been in the right place at the right time on 3 occasions when kind of interesting things were happening in the space. And I had discovered coaching, and using the podcast as a platform, realized, and my blog as well, realized that there were a lot of questions out there. So I basically took some certification courses, studied coaching, and just launched a practice because it's not a regulated industry by any stretch. So I just started practicing. And by the time this board certification was created, I don't know, 7 years ago or so, 8 years, I had already logged 500 hours of coaching. So I kind of got grandfathered in. I did have to take the exam to get board certified, but I didn't have to do the programs that people now do to become board certified. And I was in one of those first cohorts that got that NCBC, that board certified nurse coach designation. So I was really proud of that, happy about that. And I think it's a great thing that there's this coaching certification / designation that's recognized by the profession, because I think professionalizing coaching vis-a-vis nursing has been really important for its credibility.
And what exactly are these new nurses that you're coaching, or experienced nurses? What are you coaching them on?
I coach nurses, what I say, across the nursing lifespan. So sometimes, not very often, but I'll be contacted by people who are still in nursing school who want help kind of planning and getting ready, like say applying for a nurse residency upon graduation. So I do help people with that. And I do help a lot of newer nurses who are just trying to find their sea legs in this profession that can be kind of dizzying and a little confusing and scary. And after that, I would say the majority of my clients are seasoned anywhere from 4 to 5 years in, which is the time when I think a lot of nurses start going like, what do I want to do now that I have 3, 4, 5, 6 years under my belt? What should I do? Like, there's so many choices. And then I also get a lot of people closer to my age. I'm in my late 50s. So I get a lot of nurses who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, either who are entering the profession as a second or third career, or more likely they're kind of in the middle of their career or even towards the end. And they're fishing around, like, what do I want my 40s to look like? What do I want to do in my 60s? Or what if I started a business? What would that look like? So I get a lot of people in that kind of center of their career. That seems to be a lot of the people I attract. And they're all fascinating because they all have these ideas about what they want, and maybe they have children or aging parents, or they might be aging themselves. Well, everyone's aging, but they might be, getting towards retirement, and they might be thinking, how do I want my life to look? So I call it holistic career coaching because sure, I can help people with resumes and cover letters and all that kind of stuff. I'm happy to do that. But I also help people a lot with looking at pulling the camera back and taking a big bird's eye view of their life and career, if I can mix metaphors, which I do all the time.
Which coaching certification would you recommend if there was a nurse that wanted to get their certification?
Yeah, I would highly recommend the board certified nurse coach, the NC-BC, or there's a board certified health and wellness nurse coach, the HWNC-BC. Both are administered by the American Holistic Nurse Credentialing Corporation, and there are different pathways through which you can reach that point of taking the exam. There's Wisdom of the Whole coaching with Linda Bark, one of the people who created this entire designation. There's also INCA, the International Nurse Coach Association, headed up by Barbie Dossi, who lives here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She's been around for years and has been at the spearhead of everything in nursing, especially holistic and integrative nursing. So then there's other smaller organizations that also prepare people for the exam, including the Nurse Coach Collective. So there's a lot of different choices, and you just have to reach out to them, talk to them, vet them, talk to graduates, kind of get a sense of which program feels best to you. And they're all good. They all offer something special. And in the end, you take the exam, get your certification, and then you're off and running.
All right, we're going to just change gears a little bit.
Sure.
Since this is the month of Men's Health Month, tell us what common misconceptions are about being a male nurse.
Oh boy.
Even though you don't do much of the bedside as much anymore.
Not as much anymore, but I remember back in the day, like late 90s, I became a nurse in 96. I remember a lot of older men, like kind of World War II, that kind of age, that kind of Eisenhower generation. They'd say things like, I'm not going to have a man take care of me, be things like that. Then it would also be things like, oh, so you weren't smart enough to become a doctor? I got asked that question many times. So the misconceptions tend to run, this is a total generalization, but I'm just going to go for it. It tends to run more among the older generations, especially that kind of World War II generation, who are now like in their 80s and 90s, right? So the younger ones, I think, are more used to and have had male nurses contextualized for them. And I think it's becoming more normal, though still being still less than 10% of the profession, men still aren't. When you stop someone on the street and you ask them who a nurse is, I think 9 out of 10 people will mention a woman. So I think there's a way to go. And for those of us who've entered the profession over the years, we put up with some of those colorful statements that people make about why we might have chosen nursing, which can, historically, some of your viewers and listeners may not know this, but nursing was originally, back in the 20th century, called a pink collar job. Like, it was one of those jobs that women did: teaching, nursing, childcare. It's no longer considered pink collar, of course, but that's how it was for many, many years.
Yes. What role do you think male nurses play in men's health and prevention?
Well, I would hazard a guess, an educated guess as a man and a nurse, that, for instance, not that a man can't do GYN care, but when a woman does GYN care in women's health, the woman has a personal stake and a personal experience of what it's like to have a female body. And it's not that women can't provide men's health care to men, but men have the contextualization of knowing, like, oh, that's what it's like to have a prostate, or that's what it's like to have erectile dysfunction, right? So I think some men, like those older generations, for instance, don't feel comfortable with a man touching them or caring for them because of, we can say, enculturated homophobia or whatever it happens to be, right? But I think a man can understand and relate to the problems another man has with his health, just like a woman can. And not to say we can't do opposite gender care, which we do all the time, but there's something to that, isn't there?
Definitely, like the whole notion of representation amongst, providers and their patients. It's the same type of concept.
Right. Like Hispanic people can have a real appreciation if their doctor or nurse is Latina or, and the same for a Black patient who's being treated by someone who looks like them and maybe comes from a background like them or can understand some of the things that that person might have been through culturally or historically or their family. So, it's not a perfect world by any stretch of the imagination, but sometimes that keen sense of kinship, even if it's just one small part of your life, can just let a patient relax just a tiny bit. And I think if that happens, there's a good reason why it's happening. And I think it can improve the care in certain cases, not all the time.
Love that. What advice do you have for male nurses regarding their personal wellness?
Well, I think first, men need to be aware that their health is multidimensional, right? So sure, there's the physical health, your prostate health, your cardiac health, your brain health, all those things, right? Men have particular health issues and health challenges that they need to keep tabs on, especially as they get older. I'm almost 60, so, there's things I'm aware of that have changed over the last 10 or 20 years for sure, even over the last 5 during my 50s. I think men also have to be aware that in this day and age, in the 21st century, being aware of one's spiritual wellness and emotional wellness and level of, let's say, emotional, relational, and behavioral intelligence is very important, because relationships are really crucial to health. And there's plenty of research out there about the power of social connection and the power of feeling a sense of community and belonging. And I don't mean to harp on the older generations. That's not what I believe in terms of younger generations and older, but there are certain ways of thinking and being in the world that have shifted in the last 30 to 40 to even 50 years, going back to, let's say, the 1960s. And I think there's this kind of newer view of what masculinity truly is that's changed over these last few generations. And I think there's lots of enculturation for women and also for men. And we need to be aware of where our place is. And we need to be aware of the ways in which maybe we've been taught not to cry and not to show emotion and not to get too close to people, and realize that it doesn't necessarily serve us or our families or our loved ones very well. And I think if we can keep an eye on the multidimensional aspects of men's health, all the better.
Love that. Let's switch gears again.
Go for it.
We're going to talk about mentorship. Do you think it's important for nurses to have mentors? And if so, why?
I do. And oftentimes I believe, and I've observed, that precepting and mentorship often get conflated. When you're getting precepted, it's sort of like often, generally, a time-limited relationship. And you're getting precepted usually for a particular role, right? So you take a job in ICU, you've been working in step down or telemetry, you have a preceptor who's hopefully super wonderful and connected and interested and interesting, and they precept you and get you on your feet so that you can kind of launch out of the nest, right? And kind of go from fledgling to seasoned ICU nurse, right? Mentoring is a different kind of process. It usually does not involve, or in my definition of it, it doesn't involve like someone teaching you how to be an ICU nurse. It means having this person who you choose and who chooses you as a mentee, whether it's short term, like you ask someone to be your mentor for the next 6 months and check in once a month. And I know people who do this. I encourage my clients to. And that person is a guide, an advisor, a helper, a mentor, and they can kind of, you can bounce ideas off them and not be afraid to run the tough questions by them about your life and your career. And I've had many mentors, some of whom knew they were my mentors. And I still have mentors who don't even know they are. They're simply people who I watch closely, and I seek to emulate, because I think, wow, I love the way Barbie Dossi does the things she does in the world. And I just keep an eye on her because I think she's amazing. And when we are able to meet and talk, that's really great. But I've never asked her to be my mentor. And people have asked me to be their mentors, and I've done that before. And usually, it lasts a period of time. Some employers will have mentorship programs, and they can be done very well. And sometimes they can be done not so well. But I think finding mentors, people you emulate and can look to for guidance, is super important.
I agree. What advice do you have for new nurses entering the nursing profession in 2022?
We have several more hours, right? Okay.
No, we have no. Yes.
First of all, we just talked about the multidimensionality of health, right? So yes, you're entering a profession. Yes, there's a lot to learn. You've got to learn the task-based aspects of nursing if you're doing, task-based care. You also need to identify within yourself what it means to be a nurse. And I don't mean that to sound cliche. I mean, what does it mean to you to be one? Is it strictly because you thought it was a really good career and it's something you felt you needed to do to raise to support your family? Is it something your parents told you should do? Or was it what we sometimes say a calling, which also can sound cliche, but I think a lot of us can relate to that notion. Like, ask a lot of people why they became a nurse, and they'll say, I really, really like to help people. I like to be of service. Yeah. And if that's your thing, that's awesome. And that's true for many, many nurses. So you have to, of course, learn the ropes of what you're doing. You also need to take care of yourself at the same time. And when I say self-care, I don't necessarily mean only, those kind of like superficial articles about self-care that talk about taking bubble baths and going for walks and, which is great. But I mean the deeper self-care, like the very insightful, what I call compassionate self-assessment that you do over time. Like, what's really making me tick? Like, what are my deeper motivators? What are the things I'm grateful for? Where are the areas where I feel like I need to grow? And why am I here? And why am I doing this? Right? And I think if you can look at your career as a nurse from the short term, midterm, and long term, you look at the short term, like, okay, got to pass the NCLEX, got to get a job, got to learn some stuff, right? And then the midterm, like, where am I headed? And then maybe the longer term, if you can visualize 20 years, it's like, what is the general direction on which I want to travel, and be ready to pivot if that changes. Take into consideration not just your work style, but your lifestyle. Do you have children? Are you planning to have children? Are your parents aging, and do you need to be prepared to take care of them? Do you want to leave the country and work in Qatar? It's like, what do you want to do? And have an eye on the prize of where you think you might be going, and keep your spouse and your loved ones in on the conversation. So that's kind of like my holistic view of how you can approach your career, not should, but how you could approach your career.
That is great advice.
Thanks.
Lastly, where can we find you and learn more about you?
Okay. The main what I'd call clearinghouse for my stuff would be nursekeith.com. It's pretty easy to remember. If you're a podcast person, I have over 400 episodes. They're on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon, all the different podcast things. So if you just type in the Nurse Keith Show or even Nurse Keith, it'll come up. Those are the main places. And then from my website, you'll find me on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and all those sorts of things. And I also write for Nursejournal and a lot of other publications. So I kind of pop up. If you kind of look for me, I'm around.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate this. It was great advice. And I think for nurses, like you said, we do need to look at the profession holistically. You know, it can't just be like, I'm just doing a job. Because I've
Yeah.
met, you know, I've worked with amazing nurses and they just don't know what else to do but, you know, the bedside. Like they can't see past that.
Many don't even know they can do anything other than acute care, which
I
blows my
know.
mind because only about 55 to 60% of nurses work in acute care at best. So what are all those other nurses
Yeah,
doing every
doing.
day? Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much. Hopefully this will open the eyes of some nurse that listens to this interview, but I totally appreciate it.
Thanks, Joelle. It's an honor and privilege, and it's super fun.